The cardiac monitor in room 447 of Presbyterian Memorial Hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, began its alarm sequence at 2:23 a.m. on a Thursday in late September, the electronic tone cutting through the ambient hum of the fourth-floor medical surgical unit with the kind of urgency that made nurses move faster and residents look up from their charting. Denise Crawford was mopping the hallway 12 feet from the door when she heard it, and something in the particular pattern of the alarm, in the rhythm of the tones and the quality of the sound as it filtered through the partially open door, made her stop mid-stroke and turn toward the room. She was 51 years old, wearing the burgundy scrubs that identified her as environmental services staff at Presbyterian Memorial, and she had been cleaning hospital floors on the night shift for 7 years since the financial collapse that had forced her to leave nursing school 3 semesters short of her degree. The thing about working nights in a hospital is that you develop an ear for which alarms matter, and which are just the background static of institutional healthcare, the false positives and the technical glitches and the minor deviations that nurses silence with a keystroke. But this alarm had a quality that Denise recognized from her clinical rotations, from the intensive care unit placement, where she had learned to distinguish between stable patients and patients who were crashing, and her body responded before her conscious mind had fully processed what she was hearing. Dr. Michael Hendricks was already in the room when Denise reached the doorway, standing at the bedside with a tablet in his hand, and an expression that suggested he was more annoyed than concerned by the interruption to whatever he had been doing. He was 34 years old, a third-year resident in internal medicine, and he carried himself with the particular confidence that came from having graduated from Duke Medical School and having matched into a competitive residency program at a hospital where his father had served on the board of directors. The patient in the bed was an elderly black woman, maybe 75 or 80, connected to the cardiac monitor that was still alarming, and to an IV line that was running clear fluids into her left arm. Denise stood in the doorway, her mop still in hand, watching as Dr. Hendricks reached up to silence the monitor without checking the patient's vital signs or examining her directly. His attention was on the tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be lab results or imaging reports, and Denise felt the small spike of alarm that came from recognizing a disconnect between what the monitor was communicating and what the doctor was attending to. "Excuse me, doctor," Denise said, her voice carrying the careful deference that hospital hierarchies required from people in her position. "The patient's respiratory rate looks high, and her color isn't good." Dr. Hendricks glanced up from the tablet, his gaze moving from Denise to the patient and back to Denise with the kind of dismissive assessment that suggested he had already categorized her as someone whose input was not relevant to his clinical decision-making. "The monitor's fine, just a loose lead, you can go back to your mopping." But the monitor was not fine, and Denise could see what Dr. Hendricks apparently could not or would not see, which was that the patient's chest was rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths, that her lips had a dusky quality that suggested inadequate oxygenation, that her hands were clutching at the blanket with the kind of restless movement that indicated distress. Denise had seen patients who looked like this during her clinical rotations, had learned to recognize the signs of respiratory compromise, and every instinct she had developed during her 3 years of nursing education was telling her that this patient needed immediate intervention. "Doctor, I really think you should check her oxygen saturation. She looks like she's in respiratory distress." Denise stepped further into the room, abandoning her mop in the hallway, knowing that she was exceeding the boundaries of her role, but unable to walk away when a patient's life might be at stake. Dr. Hendricks turned fully toward her now, his expression shifting from dismissive to irritated. "I'm the doctor here. I've examined the patient. Her vitals are stable. What I need you to do is leave the room so I can finish my work." The patient made a sound, a soft gasp or moan that might have been an attempt to speak, or might have been just the sound of labored breathing, and Denise saw her eyes roll back slightly, saw her level of consciousness beginning to deteriorate. There was a pulse oximeter clipped to the patient's finger, the small device that measured oxygen saturation continuously, and Denise could see that the reading on the monitor screen was dropping, the number that should have been in the high 90s now showing 87% and declining. Stories like this one, accounts of moments when institutional hierarchies and professional credentialism create barriers to good care, when someone with knowledge is dismissed because they lack the right credentials or occupy the wrong social position, deserve to be shared widely. If what you are reading resonates with your own experiences in healthcare or in other institutional settings, consider the value of ensuring that others hear these chronicles too, that the patterns they illuminate become part of the public conversation about how we can do better. Her oxygen saturation is at 87, Denise said, her voice urgent now, abandoning deference because the patient's condition was deteriorating in real time. She needs oxygen. She might need respiratory support. You need to call a rapid response. Dr. Hendricks stared at her for a long moment, his jaw tight, and Denise understood that she had crossed a line, had challenged his authority in a way that residents, particularly residents from privileged backgrounds accustomed to deference, found intolerable. But she also understood that the patient's oxygen saturation was continuing to drop, that the woman's breathing was becoming more labored, that seconds mattered in situations like this. "Get out, Doctor," Hendricks said, his voice low and controlled but absolutely firm. "Right now, or I'm calling security." Denise made a decision. She turned and walked quickly to the nurse's station, where the charge nurse, a white woman in her late 40s named Barbara Simmons, was reviewing medication orders on a computer screen. "Barbara, the patient in 447 is in respiratory distress. Her oxygen sat is dropping, she's tachypneic, her color is poor. Dr. Hendricks is in there, but he's not responding. We need to call a rapid response." Barbara looked up from the computer, her expression shifting from routine attention to focused concern. She had worked at Presbyterian Memorial for 20 years, had learned to trust her gut about when situations required immediate escalation, and she had also learned to trust Denise Crawford, who had been cleaning the 4th floor for 7 years and who had a way of noticing things that other environmental services staff did not notice. "You sure?" Barbara asked, already standing and moving toward room 447. "I'm sure. I just came from the room. Hendricks told me to leave, but I'm telling you, that patient needs help now." Barbara walked into room 447 with Denise behind her, and what she saw confirmed Denise's assessment immediately. The patient's oxygen saturation was now at 82%. Her respiratory rate was in the high 30s, and she was visibly struggling to breathe. Dr. Hendricks was still standing at the bedside with his tablet, and he turned toward Barbara with visible relief, apparently expecting support in his decision to dismiss Denise's concerns. "Barbara, can you escort environmental services out of here? She's interfering with patient care." Barbara ignored him and moved directly to the patient, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder and checking her responsiveness, then reaching for the oxygen tubing coiled on the wall mount behind the bed. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm going to put some oxygen on you, okay? Just breathe slowly." She placed the nasal cannula on the patient and turned the oxygen flow to 4 liters per minute, then picked up the phone on the wall and pressed the button for the rapid response team, the group of critical care specialists who responded to emergencies throughout the hospital. "This is Barbara Simmons, 4th floor med-surg. I'm calling a rapid response for room 447. Patient with acute respiratory distress, oxygen saturation in the low 80s, tachypneic, altered mental status." Dr. Hendricks's face flushed. "I didn't authorize a rapid response. This patient is stable. Her symptoms are consistent with anxiety, not respiratory failure." Barbara turned to look at him, her expression professionally neutral but her voice carrying an edge. "With respect, doctor, her oxygen saturation is at 80% and dropping. That's not anxiety. That's hypoxemia. The rapid response team will be here in 2 minutes." The rapid response team arrived 90 seconds later, led by Dr. Sarah Chen, an attending physician in pulmonary critical care, who moved with the efficient speed of someone who had responded to hundreds of these calls. She assessed the patient quickly, checking breath sounds with her stethoscope, reviewing the vital signs on the monitor, asking Barbara for the timeline of symptom onset and interventions provided. "Breath sounds are diminished in the right lower lobe," Dr. Chen said, speaking to the respiratory therapist who had arrived with the team. "Get an arterial blood gas, set up for BiPAP in case we need positive pressure, and someone get me a portable chest X-ray stat." She turned to Dr. Hendricks. "You're the admitting resident?" "Yes, the patient was admitted this afternoon for cellulitis. She's been stable all evening. This is an overreaction to what was probably just anxiety." Dr. Chen looked at him with the kind of expression that attending physicians reserved for residents who had missed something important. "Her oxygen saturation is at 78% on 4 liters of oxygen. That's not anxiety. That's respiratory failure. What was her admission chest X-ray? Clear. No infiltrates, no effusion, no pneumothorax. Then something's changed since admission, and we need to figure out what, fast. The respiratory therapist placed a BiPAP mask over Mrs. Patterson's face, the device that would force pressurized air into her lungs and help her oxygenate while they determined the underlying cause of her respiratory failure. The portable X-ray machine arrived 3 minutes later, wheeled into the room by a technician who positioned the equipment with practiced efficiency and took the images while the team continued their assessment. Denise stood in the hallway outside the room, still holding her mop, watching through the open door as the rapid response team worked. Dr. Hendricks had stepped back from the bedside, no longer directing care, but not absent either, his posture stiff and his expression angry. Barbara caught Denise's eye and gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that Denise had been right to raise the alarm, that her intervention had likely saved Mrs. Patterson's life. The X-ray results appeared on the portable computer screen 4 minutes later, and Dr. Chen studied them with focused attention. There it is, large pleural effusion on the right side, probably developed rapidly post-admission. That's what's compromising her respiratory function. A pleural effusion, fluid accumulating in the space between the lung and the chest wall, compressing the lung and preventing adequate gas exchange. It was a complication that could develop quickly, particularly in patients with heart failure, or infection, or malignancy, and it required immediate intervention to drain the fluid and allow the lung to re-expand. We need to transfer her to ICU and do a thoracentesis, Dr. Chen said, already typing orders into the computer. Get me interventional pulmonology consult and let ICU know we're bringing them an acute respiratory failure. She looked at Barbara. Who called the rapid response? I did, but Denise Crawford, Environmental Services, was the one who first noticed the patient was in distress and alerted me. Dr. Hendricks had dismissed her concerns. Dr. Chen looked out into the hallway where Denise stood, their eyes meeting for a moment. Thank you, Denise. Your awareness saved this patient's life. We'll make sure that's documented. The ICU team arrived 8 minutes later with a transport stretcher, and Mrs. Patterson was moved with careful efficiency, the BiPAP mask still in place, the oxygen saturation slowly climbing as the pressurized ventilation compensated for her compromised lung function. The hallway cleared, the equipment was wheeled away, and the 4th floor returned to its normal nighttime rhythm of quiet monitoring and occasional alarms. Denise picked up her mop and went back to cleaning, but her hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline from the emergency still coursing through her system. She had been right. She had recognized a patient in distress, had alerted the appropriate personnel, had persisted when her concerns were dismissed, and her actions had contributed directly to saving a woman's life. But she had also exceeded the boundaries of her role, had challenged a physician's authority, had created a situation that would have consequences beyond the immediate clinical outcome. Barbara found her 20 minutes later, mopping the corridor near the medication room. Denise, you need to come to the break room. We need to talk. The break room was a small space with uncomfortable furniture and a coffee maker that produced liquid that tasted like institutional negligence, but it was private, and Barbara closed the door before she spoke. You did the right thing. I want you to know that. Mrs. Patterson would have died if you hadn't pushed. Her oxygen saturation was in the 70s by the time the rapid response team got there. Another few minutes, and she would have coded. But, Denise said because she could hear the unspoken qualifier in Barbara's tone, but Dr. Hendricks is filing a complaint. He's claiming you interfered with patient care, exceeded your scope of practice, and created a hostile environment by questioning his clinical judgment. He's also claiming that calling the rapid response was unnecessary and that I overreacted to your concerns. Denise felt her stomach tighten. She had known there would be consequences, had understood that challenging a doctor, particularly a white male doctor from a privileged background, would create institutional blowback, regardless of whether she had been right. The hospital had hierarchies, and those hierarchies existed to protect physicians from accountability as much as they existed to ensure quality care. What happens now? Denise asked. There'll be an investigation. Hospital administration will review what happened, interview everyone involved, look at the medical records. Your supervisor will probably want to meet with you. They might suspend you pending the outcome. I'm going to write a detailed incident report, documenting everything I observed. including the fact that Mrs. Patterson was in acute respiratory failure and that your intervention was appropriate. Dr. Chen will probably write something similar, but I can't promise how administration will see it, because I'm environmental services and he's a doctor, because the hospital protects doctors, especially residents from prominent families, and because questioning a physician's judgment, even when you're right, is seen as a threat to the hierarchy that the entire system depends on. It was an honest assessment, the kind of institutional truth that nurses understood intimately and that environmental services staff understood even more intimately, the knowledge that the hospital was not primarily organized around patient care, but around maintaining the social and professional hierarchies that determined who had authority and who did not. Denise went home at the end of her shift, driving through the empty streets of Charlotte at 7 in the morning, while the city was waking up, and she sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment complex for 10 minutes before she could summon the energy to go inside. She had saved a patient's life. She should have felt satisfied, vindicated, proud of her clinical judgment and her willingness to advocate. Instead, she felt anxious and uncertain, knowing that the consequences of her actions were still unfolding, that the institutional machinery had been set in motion, and that she had no control over where it would lead. Her daughter, Jasmine, was awake when Denise walked in, sitting at the kitchen table with a textbook and a cup of coffee, studying for her nursing school exams. Jasmine was 24 years old, in her second year of an accelerated BSN program, following the path that Denise had been forced to abandon when her husband left and the mortgage payments became impossible to manage, and nursing school tuition became an unaffordable luxury. "How was work?" Jasmine asked, looking up from her textbook. Denise poured herself coffee and sat down across from her daughter. "I saved a patient's life, and now I might get fired for it." She explained what had happened in room 447, the respiratory distress and Dr. Hendrix's dismissal, and the rapid response and the complaint. Jasmine listened with the kind of focused attention that nursing students learn to apply to clinical scenarios, and when Denise finished, her daughter's expression was troubled. "They can't fire you for that. You did exactly what you should have done. You recognized a patient in crisis, and you escalated appropriately. I exceeded my scope of practice. I challenged a doctor. I interfered with care, those are the terms they'll use, and they're not technically wrong even if what I did was right. What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Wait for my supervisor to call. Hope that the investigation clears me. Try not to think about what happens if I lose this job, because I can't lose this job. Not now. Not with your tuition due next semester, and rent due every month and the car making that sound that means something expensive is about to break." Jasmine reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You did the right thing. Whatever happens, you did the right thing. That has to count for something." But Denise had lived long enough and worked in enough institutional settings to know that doing the right thing often counted for very little when it collided with institutional hierarchies and professional authority and the racial dynamics that shaped every interaction in environments where white people held power and black people did not. The call from her supervisor came that afternoon, waking Denise from the shallow sleep she had managed after finally lying down at 9 a.m. The supervisor's name was Gerald Morton, a white man in his mid-50s who managed the Environmental Services Department with a focus on efficiency metrics and budget adherence and minimal employee complaints that might create problems for his own career advancement. "Denise, we need to meet. Today, if possible. There's been a complaint filed and we need to discuss it before it goes further up the chain." They met at Presbyterian Memorial at 3 p.m. In Gerald's small office in the basement level of the hospital, where environmental services and facilities management had their administrative spaces. The office smelled like industrial cleaning products and old coffee, and Gerald sat behind a metal desk with a folder in front of him that presumably contained the complaint and whatever documentation had been gathered so far. "I'm going to be direct," Gerald said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Doctor, Hendrix has filed a formal complaint alleging that you interfered with patient care, exceeded your scope of practice, and created a hostile work environment by repeatedly questioning his clinical judgment. He's asking that you be terminated." Denise had expected this, but hearing it stated explicitly still felt like a physical impact. "Did he mention that the patient almost died? That she was in respiratory failure? That if I hadn't called Barbara, that woman would have coded?" He disputes that characterization. He claims the patient was experiencing anxiety and that the rapid response was an overreaction that created unnecessary expense and disruption. He also claims that you have no medical training and no basis for making clinical assessments. I have 3 years of nursing school, Denise said, her voice tight with controlled anger. I did clinical rotations in ICU, in emergency, in med-surg. I know what respiratory distress looks like, and I know what happens when someone's oxygen saturation drops into the 70s. Gerald looked uncomfortable, the expression of a middle manager who understood that he was being asked to adjudicate a situation that involved clinical judgment and professional hierarchy and racial dynamics that exceeded his authority or expertise. The problem is that nursing school doesn't give you credentials. You're not a nurse. You're environmental services. And when environmental services tells a doctor how to practice medicine, that's a violation of scope. Even when the doctor is wrong? Even when the patient is dying? The hospital has to trust that doctors know what they're doing. If we start allowing non-clinical staff to override physician judgment, the whole system breaks down. It was an argument that prioritized institutional order over patient safety, that valued hierarchy over competence, and Denise understood that she was not going to win this debate on its own terms. What she needed was evidence, documentation, support from people with credentials that the hospital would respect. What about Barbara Simmons? She's a charge nurse. She has credentials. She agreed with my assessment and called the rapid response herself. Is Dr. Hendricks claiming she exceeded her scope too? Dr. Hendricks's complaint is focused on you, not on Barbara. But the hospital is reviewing the entire incident, including Barbara's decision to call the rapid response. And Dr. Chen? She's an attending physician. She confirmed that Mrs. Patterson was in respiratory failure, that she had a pleural effusion, that she needed immediate intervention. Is the hospital saying Dr. Chen was wrong too? Gerald shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. No one is saying Dr. Chen was wrong. What they're saying is that you, as environmental services staff, should not have been making clinical assessments in the first place. If you had concerns, you should have reported them to a nurse and then left the room when the doctor told you to. I did report them to a nurse. I reported them to Barbara. But before that, I tried to tell Dr. Hendricks directly because I was in the room, and I could see that the patient was in distress. What was I supposed to do? Walk away and let her die because speaking up violated protocol? The question hung in the air, and Gerald did not have a good answer because there was no good answer. No response that reconciled the hospital's institutional priorities with basic human decency and the ethical obligation to prevent harm when harm was preventable. Look, Gerald said finally, I'm going to be honest with you. This is above my pay grade. The complaint is being reviewed by risk management and HR. They'll interview everyone involved, review the medical records and make a determination. In the meantime, you're on paid administrative leave. Don't come to work until you hear from HR. Am I being investigated or am I being fired? You're being investigated. But I'll tell you that Dr. Hendricks comes from a well-connected family, and the hospital tends to be very protective of physicians, especially residents. So you should probably prepare yourself for the possibility that this doesn't go your way. Denise left the meeting and sat in her car in the hospital parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. She had been placed on administrative leave for saving a patient's life, pending an investigation that would likely prioritize protecting the hospital and the physician over acknowledging that she had done the right thing. The unfairness of it was crushing, the casual institutional violence of a system that punished competence when competence threatened hierarchy. She called Jasmine, who was between classes, and explained the situation. Her daughter's response was immediate and fierce. They can't do this. They can't punish you for saving someone's life. We need to fight this. We need to get a lawyer. Lawyers cost money we don't have. Then we'll find someone who does employment law, someone who works on contingency. This is discrimination, Mum. They're punishing you because you're black and you're environmental services, and you dared to tell a white doctor he was wrong. That's actionable. It probably was actionable, but the gap between having a valid legal claim and actually prevailing in litigation was enormous, particularly for someone like Denise, who lived paycheck to paycheck and could not afford to be unemployed for the months or years it might take to resolve a case. But Jasmine was right that fighting was better than accepting, that institutional injustice persisted precisely because people accepted it rather than challenging it. "Okay," Denise said. "Let's find a lawyer." The lawyer's name was Marcus Webb, and he worked out of a small office in the South End neighborhood of Charlotte, practicing employment law with a focus on discrimination and wrongful termination cases. Jasmine had found him through an internet search and a referral from one of her nursing school professors who had consulted with him on a workplace case, and he had agreed to meet with Denise for a free initial consultation. Marcus was a black man in his late 40s, wearing a suit that was professional but not expensive, and he had the kind of direct manner that suggested he had little patience for corporate evasion or institutional doublespeak. Denise walked him through the events of that Thursday morning, describing Mrs. Patterson's respiratory distress, Dr. Hendricks's dismissal of her concerns, Barbara's rapid response call, Dr. Chen's intervention, and the subsequent complaint and administrative leave. Marcus took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions, and when Denise finished, he sat back in his chair and regarded her thoughtfully. "This is discrimination," he said without preamble, "and it's retaliation. The hospital is punishing you for exercising your right to raise concerns about patient safety, and they're doing it in a way that's clearly motivated by your race and your position in the hospital hierarchy. A white physician or even a white nurse would not be treated this way for doing what you did. Can you prove that?" Denise asked. "We can build a case. We'll need documentation of the incident, witness statements, medical records showing that Mrs. Patterson was, in fact, in respiratory failure and that your intervention was appropriate. We'll need evidence of similarly situated employees who were treated differently. And we'll need to establish a pattern, if one exists, of the hospital protecting physicians at the expense of lower-status employees, particularly black employees. What are the odds we win?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Honestly? Hard to say. Employment discrimination cases are difficult, especially against hospitals, which have significant resources and legal teams specifically dedicated to defending these kinds of claims. But you have some things in your favor. The medical record will show that Mrs. Patterson was in respiratory failure, that she needed urgent intervention, that your assessment was correct. Dr. Chen's documentation will support your version of events. Barbara Simmons can testify that you acted appropriately, and the fact that Dr. Hendricks dismissed your concerns and was demonstrably wrong creates a strong factual foundation. But the hospital will argue that you exceeded your scope of practice, that you interfered with care, that you violated policy. They'll say this isn't about race or retaliation, it's about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries, and they'll probably win that argument unless we can show a pattern of similar treatment, or unless we can demonstrate that the hospital's stated rationale is pretextual. Denise felt the familiar weight of institutional power, the understanding that even when you were right, even when you had evidence, even when you had done something unequivocally good, the system could still crush you because the system was designed to protect itself and those at the top of its hierarchies. "What do you recommend?" she asked. "I recommend we file an EEOC complaint and a lawsuit. I work on contingency, so you don't pay unless we win, and I recommend we go public. Get media involved, tell your story. Create pressure on the hospital to do the right thing. Sometimes the threat of bad publicity is more effective than legal arguments." Denise thought about Jasmine, about tuition payments and rent, and the fragile stability of their lives. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, about the woman who might have died if Denise had not spoken up. She thought about all the other black workers in hospitals and in other institutions who had knowledge and competence and judgment that was dismissed because their credentials were wrong, or their skin was the wrong color, or their position in the hierarchy was too low. If this story reaches you, if these patterns are familiar, if you have witnessed or experienced similar dynamics in healthcare or elsewhere, consider the importance of ensuring that accounts like this one do not disappear into the institutional silence that protects systems from accountability. Share this chronicle with others who need to understand how bias operates in environments that claim to prioritize care and competence. "Let's do it," Denise said. The EEOC complaint was filed a week later, formally alleging that Presbyterian Memorial Hospital had discriminated against Denise Crawford on the basis of race and had retaliated against her for engaging in protected activity, specifically raising concerns about patient safety. The complaint detailed the events of September 26th, Dr. Hendricks's dismissal of her concerns despite clear evidence of patient distress, the successful intervention by the rapid response team and the subsequent administrative leave and investigation that appeared designed to punish rather than to determine facts. The filing triggered a cascade of institutional responses. The hospital's legal team notified risk management, who notified the chief medical officer, who notified the hospital president. Within 48 hours of the EEOC filing, Denise received a call from the hospital's HR director, a woman named Patricia Gaines, requesting a meeting to discuss the situation. They met in a conference room on the second floor of the administrative wing, a space designed to be neutral and professional, and slightly intimidating with its large table and ergonomic chairs and walls decorated with photos of the hospital's history and achievements. Patricia was a white woman in her early 50s, impeccably dressed, and she had brought 2 other people with her, the hospital's general counsel, a man named Robert Chambers, and the chief nursing officer, a black woman named Dr. Beverly Morrison. The presence of Dr. Morrison was significant, and Denise understood immediately that the hospital was trying to signal that this was not about race, that they had black leadership represented, that the institutional response was being shaped by people who could not be accused of racial bias. But Denise also understood that Dr. Morrison's presence did not mean the hospital would act justly, only that they were being strategic about appearances. "Ms. Crawford," Patricia began, using the formal address that created distance rather than the familiar first name that might have suggested collegiality, "we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. We want to discuss the incident that occurred on September 26th and address your concerns about the investigation and your administrative leave." "I'm here with my attorney," Denise said, gesturing to Marcus, who sat beside her with his legal pad and a file folder containing the documentation they had assembled. "I'd like him to be part of this conversation." Patricia's expression tightened slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, Mr. Webb, thank you for joining us." Marcus inclined his head. "I'm here to ensure my client's rights are protected. Please proceed." Patricia glanced at Robert Chambers, the general counsel, who took over the conversation with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to managing legal exposure. "We've completed our internal investigation of the September 26th incident. We've reviewed the medical records, interviewed the staff involved, and assessed the events that transpired. Our findings are that Mrs. Patterson, the patient in question, did experience acute respiratory distress requiring urgent intervention. The rapid response team's intervention was appropriate and likely prevented a poor outcome." He paused as if waiting for acknowledgement, but Denise and Marcus both remained silent, waiting for the next part of the statement that would reveal what the hospital actually intended to do. "However," Robert continued, "our investigation also found that Ms. Crawford exceeded her scope of practice by conducting a clinical assessment and making recommendations to medical staff about patient care. While her intentions may have been good, her actions violated hospital policy regarding role boundaries and clinical authority. So, you're saying my client was right about the patient's condition, her intervention saved the patient's life, but you're still holding her responsible for violating policy?" Marcus's tone was carefully neutral, but the question itself was pointed. "We're saying that there are appropriate channels for raising concerns, and Ms. Crawford bypassed those channels by directly instructing a physician about patient care. She alerted the charge nurse when the physician dismissed her concerns," Marcus said. "That seems like exactly the appropriate channel. Are you suggesting she should have simply walked away when she observed a patient in respiratory failure?" Patricia intervened, attempting to steer the conversation toward what was evidently the hospital's prepared resolution. "We want to move forward constructively. We're prepared to end Ms. Crawford's administrative leave immediately, with full back pay for the time she's been out. We're also prepared to provide formal recognition of her attentiveness in identifying Mrs. Patterson's distress. And we'd like to offer Ms. Crawford a position in our patient safety program, where her observational skills and clinical knowledge could be utilized in a more appropriate capacity." It was an elegant solution from the hospital's perspective, a way to resolve the complaint without admitting wrongdoing while simultaneously appearing to reward Denise for her actions. But Denise heard the unspoken message. The hospital wanted this to go away, wanted to avoid the publicity and legal exposure that would come from EEOC proceedings or litigation, and was willing to offer just enough to make that happen. "What about Dr. Hendricks?" Denise asked. "Is he facing any consequences for dismissing my concerns and failing to recognize a patient in respiratory failure? Patricia and Robert exchanged glances, and Dr. Morrison spoke for the first time, her voice measured. Dr. Hendrix's performance is being reviewed by the residency program director and the chief of medicine. That's a separate process, and we can't discuss it in detail, but I can tell you that the incident is being taken seriously, which means he's receiving counseling or additional training, but he's not being disciplined, Marcus said. It was a statement, not a question. Meanwhile, my client, who correctly identified a life-threatening situation and potentially saved a patient's life, was placed on administrative leave and is now being told she violated policy. The disparity is remarkable. The situations are not comparable, Robert said. Dr. Hendrix is a licensed physician. His clinical judgments, even when they're wrong, fall within the scope of his professional practice. Ms. Crawford is environmental services staff. When she makes clinical assessments, she's practicing without a license. She's not practicing medicine. She's using her education and training to recognize a patient in distress and alert appropriate personnel. That's not practicing without a license. That's being a responsible human being who happens to have clinical knowledge. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but the positions were clear, and neither side was willing to move substantially. The hospital wanted Denise to accept the offer of reinstatement and the patient safety position and to withdraw her EEOC complaint. Marcus wanted acknowledgement that Denise had been treated unfairly, meaningful consequences for Dr. Hendrix, and structural changes to prevent similar incidents. They left the meeting without resolution, and Marcus told Denise as they walked to their cars that the hospital's willingness to negotiate meant they were worried, that they understood their legal exposure was significant, and that continued pressure might yield a better outcome. "What do you think about the patient safety position?" Denise asked. "It's a promotion, more money, better title, but it's also a way for them to control you, to bring you into the administration where you're less visible and less likely to cause problems, and they'll expect you to be grateful enough that you drop the complaint." "What if I took the position but kept the complaint active?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Then you'd be playing the long game, using their offer to improve your situation while continuing to push for accountability. That's a legitimate strategy, but you need to understand that it will make you a target, that they'll be looking for reasons to get rid of you, that you'll be under more scrutiny than other employees." Denise had spent most of her adult life under scrutiny. Being black in America and working in predominantly white institutions meant constant awareness that any mistake would be magnified, any assertion of competence would be threatening, any challenge to authority would be met with retaliation. The question was not whether she would face additional scrutiny, but whether the fight was worth the cost. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, wondered whether the woman was still in ICU or had been transferred back to the regular floor, wondered whether she knew that a janitor had saved her life. She thought about Jasmine, working her way through nursing school, preparing to enter a profession where black women faced the same dynamics Denise was experiencing now. She thought about all the environmental services staff and nursing assistants and technicians who had clinical knowledge and good judgment, but who had learned to stay silent because speaking up meant risking everything. "I want to keep fighting," Denise said. "Take the position, keep the complaint active, push for changes, and I want to talk to the media, make this public, force the hospital to defend their actions in the court of public opinion, not just in legal proceedings." Marcus nodded. "Then that's what we'll do. But understand, once you go public, there's no going back. The hospital will see you as a threat, and they'll respond accordingly. You need to be ready for that." "I'm ready." The Charlotte Observer ran the story 2 weeks later, a front-page piece in the Metro section with the headline, "Hospital Janitor Credited with Saving Patient's Life, Then Placed on Leave." The article included interviews with Denise, with Barbara Simmons, and with Dr. Sarah Chen, who spoke carefully but unequivocally about the fact that Denise's intervention had been medically appropriate and likely life-saving. It included a statement from Presbyterian Memorial, defending their investigation as thorough and appropriate, while noting that they had offered Denise a position in patient safety. And it included context about racial disparities in healthcare, about the ways that black patients often received inferior care, and about the ways that black healthcare workers were systematically undervalued and marginalized. The article was shared widely on social media, and within 24 hours Denise's story had become part of the national conversation about race and healthcare and institutional bias. People shared their own experiences of being dismissed by doctors, of watching family members receive inadequate care, of working in hospitals where their knowledge and competence were ignored because of their credentials or their race. Patient advocacy groups picked up the story. Medical ethicists wrote opinion pieces about the importance of listening to all members of the healthcare team, regardless of professional hierarchy, and nursing organizations highlighted the case as an example of why scope of practice regulations needed to be balanced against common sense and clinical judgment. Presbyterian Memorial's Public Relations Department went into crisis mode, issuing statements emphasizing their commitment to patient safety and staff empowerment, while carefully avoiding any admission that they had mishandled the situation. Dr. Hendricks, who had not been named in the initial Observer article, was suddenly the subject of intense internet scrutiny as people attempted to identify the physician who had dismissed Denise's concerns, and the hospital had to issue additional statements about privacy and personnel matters. The publicity created pressure, and pressure created movement. 3 weeks after the Observer article ran, Denise received a call from Patricia Gaines offering an enhanced settlement, immediate reinstatement to the patient safety position with a significant salary increase, a formal letter of recognition for her actions on September 26th, a public statement from the hospital acknowledging that she had acted appropriately and that the investigation had been flawed, implementation of new training for all staff about when and how to escalate patient safety, concerns regardless of role or title, and creation of a patient safety hotline that any employee could use anonymously. Marcus reviewed the offer and advised Denise that it was substantially better than what most plaintiffs achieved in employment discrimination cases, that the hospital was essentially admitting wrongdoing without explicitly saying so, and that accepting it would allow her to return to work in a position where she could actually create change while maintaining her EEOC complaint for leverage against future retaliation. Denise accepted. She started in the patient safety position in early November, working in a small office on the 3rd floor of the administrative wing, reporting to Dr. Beverly Morrison and tasked with developing protocols for staff reporting of clinical concerns, conducting training sessions, and serving as a liaison between frontline workers and hospital leadership. The work was strange after 7 years of mopping floors and emptying trash, the shift from physical labor and night shifts to office work and day shifts and meetings with administrators. But Denise brought to the role a perspective that no one else in the hospital's leadership possessed, the lived experience of being at the bottom of the hierarchy, of having knowledge that was dismissed, of understanding how power operated in ways that made good care harder rather than easier. She designed training sessions that included scenarios based on the September 26th incident, asking staff at all levels to consider what they would do if they observed a patient in distress and their concerns were dismissed by someone with more authority. She created a pocket card that all environmental services staff and nursing assistants could carry, listing the signs of common medical emergencies and the appropriate escalation procedures. She worked with Dr. Morrison to revise the hospital's code of conduct to explicitly state that any employee who observed a patient safety concern had not just the right, but the obligation to report it, regardless of their role, and that retaliation against such reporting was grounds for immediate termination. The changes were real, but they were also limited, constrained by the institutional resistance to transformation that characterized all large organizations. Some physicians resented the new policies, viewing them as an erosion of medical authority. Some nurses welcomed them, seeing an opportunity to challenge doctors who dismissed their clinical concerns, and some environmental services staff remained skeptical, doubting that the hospital's stated commitment to listening to all voices would survive the next budget crisis or the next conflict between institutional convenience and patient safety. Denise understood the skepticism, shared it even as she worked to implement changes, but she also understood that progress was incremental, that institutional transformation happened through the accumulation of small victories and persistent pressure, and that her presence in a position of relative authority represented a crack in the hierarchy that had previously seemed impermeable. Dr. Hendricks, meanwhile, faced consequences that were both significant and insufficient. The residency program director had placed him on probation, requiring additional supervision and training in communication and clinical assessment. He had been required to meet with Mrs. Patterson and apologize for missing her respiratory distress, and he had been assigned to work with Denise on developing case studies for the patient safety training, a particularly pointed form of institutional correction that forced him to confront the fact that the janitor he had dismissed had been right and he had been wrong. The case study work was uncomfortable for both of them, conducted in stiff formal sessions where Denise described the clinical indicators she had observed, and Hendricks was required to acknowledge the errors in his assessment and judgment. He never apologized directly to Denise, never admitted that his dismissal of her concerns had been shaped by assumptions about her competence based on her role and her race. But his discomfort was palpable, and Denise took some satisfaction in that. What she did not know, because institutional privacy policies prevented her from accessing personnel records, was that Dr. Hendricks had been allowed to continue his residency with minimal disruption, that the probation was largely symbolic, and that within 6 months the incident would be noted in his file, but would not prevent him from completing his training and moving on to a fellowship or practice position where his history would be unknown. It was the same dynamic that played out across healthcare and across all institutions, the pattern where those at the top of hierarchies faced minimal consequences for failures that would have ended the careers of those at the bottom. But it was also progress compared to what would have happened without publicity, without pressure, without Denise's willingness to fight. In that alternative timeline, Hendricks would have faced no consequences at all, and Denise would have been fired for insubordination, and the institution would have continued operating exactly as it had before. Mrs. Patterson recovered from her pleural effusion and was discharged from Presbyterian Memorial 3 weeks after her respiratory failure. Before she left, Denise visited her, standing in the doorway of her room with her patient safety department badge visible and her hands folded in front of her. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm Denise Crawford. I work in patient safety here. I wanted to check on how you're doing." The elderly woman looked up from where she sat in the bedside chair, already dressed in street clothes and waiting for her daughter to arrive with the car. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, and she studied Denise for a long moment before she spoke. "You're the one who saved my life, aren't you? The janitor who told the doctor I was dying when he said I was fine?" Denise hesitated, uncertain how much Mrs. Patterson knew about what had happened, but the woman's expression was knowing, not curious. "I noticed you were having trouble breathing. I made sure the right people were alerted. My daughter told me what happened, told me there was a whole thing with the hospital, that you got in trouble for helping me, that they tried to fire you. Is that true? It's complicated, but I'm still here, and I'm working to make sure that if something like that happens again, the hospital responds better." Mrs. Patterson stood, moving slowly but steadily, and she walked over to Denise and took both of her hands in her own. "Thank you. Thank you for caring enough to speak up. Thank you for not walking away. Thank you for fighting even when they tried to punish you. You're an angel, and I'm going to pray for you every day for the rest of my life." It was the kind of gratitude that made the fighting worthwhile, that validated the risks and the costs and the ongoing uncertainty about whether institutional change would endure. Denise squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hands and thanked her, and wished her well, and as she walked back to her office she felt something shift inside her, a small easing of the anger and frustration that had been constant since September 26th. Jasmine graduated from nursing school the following May, passing her NCLEX exam on the first attempt and accepting a position in the ICU at Presbyterian Memorial. She had interviewed at other hospitals, had been offered positions with comparable pay and benefits, but she had chosen Presbyterian specifically because of what her mother had achieved there, because she wanted to be part of an institution that was at least attempting to address its biases and hierarchies, and because she believed that change happened when people committed to being present in spaces that needed transformation. Her first week on orientation, Jasmine attended Denise's patient safety training, sitting in the back of the conference room with 20 other new nurses and nursing assistants, while her mother presented scenarios and discussed escalation procedures and emphasized that everyone in the hospital, regardless of role, had a responsibility to speak up when they observed potential harm to patients. Several of the new nurses knew Jasmine was Denise's daughter, and they asked her after the training what it was like to work at the same hospital where her mother had become somewhat famous. Jasmine told them it was both inspiring and complicated, that she was proud of what her mother had accomplished, but also aware that she would be watched more closely, that any mistake she made would be magnified because of her association with someone who had challenged the institution. "Do you worry that you'll end up in a situation like your mum?" one of the nurses asked, "where you see something wrong but speaking up creates problems?" "I worry about it all the time," Jasmine said honestly. "But I also know that staying silent when patients are being harmed is not an option. So if I end up in that situation, I hope I have the courage to do what my mum did, and I hope the hospital has learned enough that the outcome is better." The months that followed brought a kind of stability to Denise's professional life that felt simultaneously secure and precarious. The awareness that her position was protected by publicity and public pressure, but that pressure could dissipate and protection could evaporate. She continued developing patient safety programs, training staff, responding to concerns raised through the hotline, and serving as a bridge between frontline workers and administration. But she also continued to encounter resistance, the institutional inertia that made change difficult, even when leadership claimed to support it. Some department managers resented having their decisions questioned by patient safety. Some physicians continued to dismiss concerns raised by nurses or nursing assistants or environmental services staff, confident that their medical degrees insulated them from accountability. And some administrators viewed the patient safety program as a necessary public relations measure, rather than as a genuine commitment to transforming institutional culture. Denise documented all of it, compiled reports, brought concerns to Dr. Morrison and to the chief medical officer, and pushed persistently for follow-through on the hospital's stated commitment to empowering all staff. It was exhausting work, the constant negotiation of institutional politics and the careful navigation of power dynamics, and the persistent awareness that one misstep could provide grounds for termination. Sometimes late at night when she could not sleep, Denise would think about the moment in room 447 when she had decided to speak up despite knowing the risks, and she would wonder whether the costs had been worth the benefits, whether the changes she had achieved justified the stress and the uncertainty, and the constant vigilance required to maintain her position. But then she would think about Mrs. Patterson, about Jasmine, about all the environmental services staff and nursing assistants who now had pocket cards listing emergency signs and hotline numbers and explicit permission to speak up when they observed patient harm. She would think about the trainings she had conducted and the policies that had been revised and the conversations that were happening now that had not been happening before. And she would understand that the costs had been necessary, that progress required people willing to absorb those costs, and that the alternative, accepting institutional injustice without resistance, was ultimately more corrosive than the fight itself. These stories, these accounts of individuals who challenge institutional hierarchies and absorb the costs of doing so, deserve circulation beyond their immediate contexts. If you recognize patterns here, if these dynamics resonate with your own experience or illuminate aspects of institutional life you have observed, consider the value of sharing this chronicle with others who need to understand that speaking up is both necessary and risky, and that the necessity does not eliminate the risk but also does not justify accepting injustice in silence. The hospital's annual Patient Safety Awards ceremony took place in October, 14 months after the September 26th incident, and Denise was informed 2 weeks in advance that she would be receiving the hospital's highest patient safety recognition for her actions in identifying Mrs. Patterson's respiratory distress. The award came with a plaque and a modest cash prize and a brief write-up in the hospital's internal newsletter, and Denise understood that it was both genuine recognition and institutional reputation management, the hospital's way of demonstrating publicly that they valued all staff contributions while carefully controlling the narrative about what had happened. She debated whether to accept the award, discussed it with Marcus Webb and with Jasmine, and ultimately decided that refusing it would be interpreted as ungrateful or hostile, while accepting it gave her a platform to speak publicly about the systemic issues that had made her intervention necessary in the first place. The ceremony was held in the hospital's main auditorium, a space that could accommodate several hundred people, and it was attended by hospital leadership, medical staff, nurses, and representatives from every department. Denise sat in the second row with the other award recipients, wearing a suit that Jasmine had helped her select, and when her name was called, She walked to the podium where the hospital president, Dr. Thomas Caldwell, stood ready to present the plaque. Dr. Caldwell was a white man in his early 60s, a surgeon by training who had moved into administration and who had been at Presbyterian Memorial for 3 years. He shook Denise's hand and handed her the plaque and spoke briefly about the importance of vigilance and teamwork in ensuring patient safety. Then he stepped back and gestured for Denise to make remarks, and she stood at the podium looking out at the audience and made a decision about what to say. "Thank you for this recognition," Denise began, her voice steady and clear. "I'm honored to receive it, but I want to be clear about what actually happened on September 26th of last year, because the official story and the real story are not quite the same." She felt the tension in the room shift, people becoming more attentive, administrators exchanging glances, Dr. Caldwell's expression becoming carefully neutral. "I recognize that a patient was in respiratory distress because I have 3 years of nursing school education, because I did clinical rotations where I learned to identify medical emergencies, because I have spent decades working in healthcare environments where I paid attention and learned. But when I tried to alert the physician caring for that patient, he dismissed my concerns. He told me I was interfering. He told me to leave the room. He did not check the patient's vital signs. He did not assess her condition. He assumed that because I was environmental services, because I was the janitor, I could not possibly have relevant knowledge or valid clinical judgment." The room was very quiet now. Denise continued, holding the plaque in her hands but not looking at it, keeping her gaze on the audience. "I'm receiving this award because I persisted, because I went to the charge nurse, because I refused to be silent when a patient was dying. But I shouldn't have had to persist. That doctor should have listened the first time I spoke. He should have checked the patient himself instead of assuming his judgment was superior simply because he had a medical degree and I had a mop." She paused, letting the words settle, watching faces in the audience. Some people looked uncomfortable. Some looked supportive. Jasmine, sitting in the middle section, was watching her mother with an expression of fierce pride. "This hospital has made changes since then. We have new policies, new training, a patient safety hotline. Those changes are important and necessary. But policies only work if people actually believe that everyone in this building, regardless of their job title, has valuable knowledge and deserves to be heard. And we're not there yet. We're better than we were, but we're not where we need to be. So I accept this award, and I thank you for it. But I also challenge everyone here, especially those in positions of authority, to examine your own assumptions about who has knowledge worth listening to. When an environmental services worker tells you something seems wrong, listen. When a nursing assistant raises a concern, take it seriously. When someone without credentials speaks up, don't dismiss them just because they don't have the right letters after their name. Because competence and judgment are not the exclusive property of people with advanced degrees, and patient safety requires us to value all contributions, not just the ones that come from people at the top of the institutional hierarchy. Denise stepped away from the podium and walked back to her seat, carrying the plaque, and the applause that followed was complicated, some people clapping enthusiastically and others offering only polite, minimal acknowledgement. Dr. Caldwell returned to the podium and moved quickly to the next award, and the ceremony continued with a tension that had not been present at the beginning. After the ceremony ended, people approached Denise with a mixture of congratulations and careful comments. Some environmental services staff thanked her for saying what needed to be said. Some nurses expressed appreciation for highlighting the importance of listening to all team members. And several administrators offered tight smiles and generic praise, while making clear through their body language that they were not pleased with her deviation from the expected grateful acceptance speech. Dr. Beverly Morrison pulled Denise aside as the auditorium was emptying. "That was risky," she said quietly. "You made people uncomfortable. Some of them are going to remember that you used this award as a platform to criticize the institution." "I didn't criticize the institution. I told the truth about what happened and about what still needs to change. In this environment, those are the same thing. Just be aware that you've made yourself more visible, and visibility cuts both ways." Denise understood what Dr. Morrison was saying, the implicit warning that speaking truth to power had consequences even when that truth was uncomfortable rather than false. But she had been visible since the Charlotte Observer article, had been a target since she filed her EEOC complaint, had been navigating institutional resistance since she took the patient safety position. The award ceremony speech had not made her situation more precarious, it had simply made the precarity more obvious. That evening, sitting with Jasmine in their apartment, Denise talked about the speech and about Dr. Morrison's warning. Jasmine, who had been in the audience and had watched the administrator's reactions, was unequivocal. You did exactly what you should have done. They gave you a platform, and you used it. If they wanted you to just say thank you and sit down, they should have given the award to someone more willing to play along. Morrison's right that I made myself a target. You were already a target, Mum. Black women in institutional spaces are always targets, especially when we refuse to be grateful for the bare minimum. The question is whether we accept that and stay silent, or whether we use whatever platform we have to push for change. It was a version of the same choice Denise had faced repeatedly over the past 14 months. The decision about whether speaking up was worth the risks, whether individual action could create institutional change, whether the costs of resistance outweighed the costs of acceptance. And each time she had chosen to speak, to push, to resist, because the alternative felt like complicity in the very systems that had sought to punish her for doing the right thing. The weeks following the awards ceremony brought a mix of support and backlash. A video of Denise's speech was posted online by someone who had recorded it on their phone, and it circulated widely on social media, generating both praise and criticism. Some people celebrated her willingness to speak truth about institutional hierarchies and racial bias in healthcare. Others accused her of being ungrateful, of using the award ceremony for self-promotion, of undermining medical professionals who were trying to do their jobs under difficult circumstances. Presbyterian Memorial's leadership issued a statement emphasizing their commitment to fostering a culture where all staff felt empowered to raise patient safety concerns, carefully avoiding either endorsing or criticizing Denise's remarks. The statement was crafted to appeal to multiple audiences simultaneously, to reassure the public that the hospital took patient safety seriously, while also signaling to staff that criticism of the institution would not be tolerated indefinitely. But the statement also acknowledged implicitly that Denise's critique had validity, that the hospital still had work to do in creating genuinely equitable conditions where knowledge was valued regardless of its source. And that acknowledgement, however carefully hedged, represented progress, the kind of institutional shift that happened when external pressure made denial more costly than admission. Dr. Hendricks completed his residency in June, 3 years after the September 26th incident, and accepted a fellowship position in cardiology at a hospital in Nashville, leaving Presbyterian Memorial without fanfare or public acknowledgement of the role he had played in the events that had transformed Denise Crawford's life and career. His departure was noted in the residency program's internal communications with the standard congratulations and well wishes, and there was no mention of the patient safety incident, no reference to the probation or the required training or the apologies he had been required to make. Denise learned about his departure through the hospital grapevine, the informal network of information sharing that existed parallel to official channels, and she felt a complicated mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that she would no longer occasionally encounter him in hallways or meetings, no longer have to navigate the discomfort of shared institutional space with someone who had tried to have her fired for saving a patient's life. Frustration that he had faced no meaningful professional consequences, that his career had continued, largely uninterrupted, that he would move to Nashville and work with new patients and new colleagues who would know nothing about his clinical judgment failures or his dismissal of a black woman's valid concerns. It was the same pattern that played out across medicine and across all professions. The reality that those at the top of hierarchies could fail upward, while those at the bottom faced termination for minor infractions or for the offense of being right when their superiors were wrong. But it was also a reminder that institutional change was not primarily about individual consequences, that the point of Denise's fight had never been to destroy Dr. Hendricks' career, but to create conditions where future Dr. Hendricks would be less likely to dismiss future Denise Crawford's. And those conditions were slowly emerging at Presbyterian Memorial, imperfectly and incompletely, but visibly. The patient safety hotline received dozens of calls each month, ranging from minor concerns about cleanliness to major concerns about clinical errors or near misses. Denise reviewed each report, escalated the serious ones to appropriate leadership, and tracked patterns that might indicate systemic problems requiring intervention. She discovered that environmental services staff were calling the hotline to report issues they had observed during their cleaning rounds, information about patient conditions or medication errors or equipment problems that they had previously kept to themselves because they assumed no one would listen. She discovered that nursing assistants were reporting concerns about nurse staffing ratios and about patients not receiving adequate care because nurses were stretched too thin. She discovered that even some nurses and physicians were using the hotline to report concerns about colleagues, preferring the anonymity of the hotline to the confrontation of direct communication. The data told a story about institutional culture, about the ways that hierarchy and fear of retaliation had created silence around patient safety concerns, and about the ways that even modest changes in reporting mechanisms could surface information that leadership needed to address. Denise compiled quarterly reports for Dr. Morrison and for the hospital's quality committee, documenting patterns and recommending interventions, and slowly the hospital began implementing changes based on those recommendations. Staffing ratios improved after multiple nursing assistants reported through the hotline that patients were being neglected during overnight shifts. Equipment maintenance protocols were revised after environmental services staff reported repeatedly finding malfunctioning beds and IV pumps. And several physicians were counseled or required to complete additional training after patterns of dismissive behavior toward nurses or lower status staff were documented through hotline reports. The changes were incremental, sometimes frustratingly slow, but they were real. And they would not have happened without Denise's willingness to speak up on September 26th, without her refusal to accept administrative leave quietly, without her persistence in pushing for structural changes rather than just individual vindication. Jasmine, working in the ICU and encountering many of the same hierarchical dynamics her mother had confronted, found herself thinking often about what it meant to navigate a profession where competence and credentials were supposed to align but often did not, where black women's knowledge was systematically undervalued, where speaking up could advance your career or end it, depending on factors largely outside your control. She had an attending physician, Dr. William Preston, who reminded her uncomfortably of Dr. Hendricks, a white man in his late 30s who treated nurses as subordinates rather than collaborators and who had a particular edge in his voice when speaking to black staff. Jasmine had watched him dismiss a black nurse's concern about a patient's deteriorating kidney function, insisting that the lab values were acceptable even though the trend over several days clearly showed progressive decline. The patient had developed acute kidney injury requiring dialysis 48 hours later, and the attending had faced no consequences because he could argue that the lab values at the moment of his assessment had been within normal range, even though the trajectory had been obvious to anyone paying attention. The black nurse had been proven right, but there was no award ceremony, no acknowledgement, no institutional recognition that her clinical judgment had been sound and that the attending's dismissal of her concerns had led to preventable harm. Jasmine told her mother about the incident over dinner one evening, expressing frustration about the gap between the hospital's stated values around staff empowerment and the daily reality of working in a hierarchy where physicians could dismiss nursing concerns with impunity. "Should I report it to patient safety?" Jasmine asked. "Or does that just put a target on my back without actually changing anything?" Denise considered the question carefully, aware that her answer would shape her daughter's approach to the rest of her career, that the lessons she taught now about when to speak up and when to stay silent would have implications that extended far beyond this one incident. "Report it," Denise said. "Document what happened. Use the hotline if you want to be anonymous, or file a formal patient safety report if you're willing to be identified, because if you don't report it, I can't track patterns. And if I can't track patterns, I can't demonstrate that there's a systemic problem requiring intervention. One report might not create consequences for that attending, but multiple reports showing a pattern of dismissing nursing concerns that creates leverage for change. What if reporting it makes it harder for me to work with him? What if he retaliates? Then you document the retaliation and you report that too. And if it becomes unbearable, you transfer to a different unit or you find a different job." But you don't stay silent when patients are being harmed, because silence protects the people causing harm and abandons the patients who need advocates. It was the same lesson Denise had learned on September 26th, the understanding that speaking up had costs, but silence had costs too, that the decision was not between safety and risk, but between different forms of risk, different distributions of harm. Choosing to speak up meant accepting professional risk. Choosing to stay silent meant accepting moral compromise and the knowledge that your silence enabled harm. Jasmine filed the patient safety report, documenting the attending's dismissal of the nurse's concerns and the subsequent patient harm. She included specific dates, patient identifiers, lab values, and the names of staff who had been present. She submitted it through the hotline as an anonymous report, and 2 weeks later, she learned through her unit manager that Dr. Preston was being required to attend additional training on interdisciplinary collaboration and communication. It was a modest consequence, unlikely to fundamentally change his approach, but it was documentation of a pattern that would make future incidents harder for him to dismiss, that created a record that could be referenced if his behavior continued, that signaled to nursing staff that their concerns were being taken seriously, at least some of the time. These small victories accumulated slowly across Presbyterian Memorial, the result of multiple people, at multiple levels, choosing to speak up, to report concerns, to challenge dismissive behavior, to use the mechanisms that Denise's fight had helped create. The institution remained hierarchical, remained shaped by racial bias and professional credentialism, remained resistant to transformation. But it was also less hostile to dissent than it had been, more receptive to concerns from lower status staff, more aware that dismissing knowledge based on role rather than content created patient safety risks that the hospital could not afford to ignore. Denise's work in patient safety continued for 3 more years, during which time she expanded the training programs, refined the reporting mechanisms, and built relationships with staff across the hospital who saw her as an advocate and a resource. She also continued her own education, taking online courses in health administration and patient safety science, accumulating credentials that supplemented her nursing school background and gave her additional legitimacy when she made recommendations or challenged administrative decisions. In March, 5 years after the September 26th incident, Denise received an email from the nursing school she had attended, the program where she had completed 3 years of coursework before financial circumstances forced her to withdraw. The email informed her that the school had implemented a new policy allowing students who had left in good academic standing to return and complete their degrees through an accelerated program designed for working adults. The program met on evenings and weekends, could be completed in 12 to 18 months depending on how many prior credits transferred, and offered financial aid packages specifically designed for students who had interrupted their education due to economic hardship. The email had been sent to dozens of former students, but reading it felt personal, felt like an opportunity that had arrived at exactly the right moment. Denise was 56 years old, established in a career that she had built from the wreckage of institutional injustice, uncertain about whether pursuing a nursing degree at this stage of her life made sense. But she was also aware that her influence at Presbyterian Memorial was limited by her lack of credentials, that administrators gave more weight to suggestions from licensed professionals than from people with patient safety titles, and that completing her degree would expand her options both within the hospital and beyond it. She discussed it with Jasmine, who was enthusiastic and supportive, offering to help with tuition costs and encouraging her mother to finish what she had started. She discussed it with Dr. Morrison, who told her that Presbyterian Memorial would provide tuition assistance for employees pursuing nursing degrees and that the hospital would work with her to accommodate the demands of school and work. And she discussed it with herself, during long walks around her neighborhood and during quiet evenings alone in her apartment, considering whether she had the energy and the focus and the determination to return to school after decades away, whether the credential was worth the effort, whether she could succeed in an educational environment that had been designed for people 20 or 30 years younger. She decided to try. She applied to the program, was accepted, and began classes in August. The coursework was challenging, not because the material was difficult, but because the pedagogy had changed significantly since she had been in school, because online learning required different skills than classroom instruction, and because balancing full-time work with part-time school and family obligations required constant strategic decisions about time and energy. But she also found the work intellectually satisfying in ways that patient safety administration was not. The return to clinical thinking and pharmacology and pathophysiology, the engagement with nursing theory and evidence-based practice, and the scientific foundations of care. And she found that her age and her experience gave her advantages that younger students did not have, that she could contextualize theoretical concepts within real-world situations, that she understood institutional dynamics in ways that textbooks could not teach. Jasmine helped her study, the two of them sitting together at the kitchen table with textbooks and notes and laptops. And there was something profoundly moving for Denise about sharing educational space with her daughter, about both of them being nurses or becoming nurses, about the generational transmission of knowledge and aspiration and persistence. The accelerated program took 14 months, and Denise graduated in November, walking across the stage at the nursing school's commencement ceremony to receive her degree, while Jasmine cheered from the audience. She took the NCLEX exam 6 weeks later, passed on the first attempt, and became a licensed registered nurse at age 57, 30 years after she had first begun pursuing that credential. Presbyterian Memorial offered her a promotion, transitioning her from patient safety coordinator to nurse manager for patient safety and quality, a position that came with additional authority, a higher salary, and direct supervision of a small team working on safety initiatives across the hospital. The promotion formalized what had already been true in practice, which was that Denise had become integral to the hospital's patient safety operations, and that her knowledge and judgment were valued enough to justify the kind of institutional recognition that had once seemed impossible. But the promotion also meant that Denise was no longer primarily an advocate for frontline workers, no longer occupying the space between environmental services and administration where she had been able to surface concerns without being fully captured by institutional priorities. She was management now, part of the leadership structure, responsible for implementing policies as much as for challenging them. It was a complicated transition, requiring Denise to navigate tensions between her history as someone who had been punished for speaking up and her current role as someone tasked with creating conditions where others could speak up safely. Some environmental services staff and nursing assistants who had trusted her when she was one of them became more cautious, uncertain whether she would still prioritize their concerns now that she had moved into management. Some nurses welcomed her promotion, seeing it as evidence that the hospital genuinely valued clinical judgment, regardless of credential pathways, and some administrators viewed her promotion as successful co-optation, the transformation of a potential troublemaker into a team player. Denise understood all of these dynamics, understood that her position was both opportunity and constraint, both platform and limitation. But she also understood that influence required institutional position, that creating change from the outside had limits, and that her ability to implement systemic reforms was greater as a nurse manager than it had been as patient safety coordinator or as environmental services staff. She used that influence deliberately and strategically. She hired 2 additional staff for her team, both of them black women, one a nurse with emergency department experience, and one a former nursing assistant who was completing her nursing degree. She restructured the patient safety training to include more content on implicit bias and on how assumptions about competence based on race or role created barriers to good care. She advocated successfully for a policy requiring root cause analyses for all cases where staff concerns about patient safety had been dismissed by physicians and where subsequent harm occurred, creating accountability mechanisms that had not existed before. And she continued to tell her own story, using it in training sessions and in conversations with new employees, and in presentations to hospital leadership as an illustration of why listening to all staff mattered, why hierarchy could be dangerous, why institutional culture needed to value knowledge regardless of its source. 5 years after her promotion to nurse manager, 10 years after the September 26th incident that had transformed her life and career, Denise stood in a conference room presenting to the hospital's board of directors about patient safety outcomes. The data showed measurable improvements in early identification of patient deterioration, reductions in preventable adverse events, and increases in staff reporting of safety concerns. The data also showed persistent disparities, with black patients still experiencing worse outcomes than white patients, and with black staff still reporting higher rates of having their concerns dismissed by physicians. "We've made progress," Denise told the board, standing at the front of the room with her PowerPoint presentation displayed on the screen behind her. "But we have not solved the underlying problems. Bias, hierarchy, and assumptions about who has knowledge worth respecting continue to create barriers to optimal care. What we've done is create better mechanisms for surfacing those barriers and addressing them. What we haven't done is eliminate the conditions that create the barriers in the first place." The board chair, a white man who had been on the board for 15 years, asked the obvious question. What would it take to eliminate those conditions? Honest reckoning with how race and class and professional hierarchy shape every interaction in this hospital. Willingness to redistribute power and authority in ways that make physicians uncomfortable. Sustained investment in training and accountability mechanisms even when they're expensive or inconvenient. And leadership that prioritizes equity and justice over institutional reputation and risk management. It was a more direct answer than board members typically heard from hospital employees, and the room was quiet for a moment. Then the board chair nodded slowly and said, "That's a lot to ask." "Yes," Denise agreed, "but it's what's required. The alternative is to continue making incremental improvements while accepting that the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged, which means accepting that black patients will continue to receive inferior care and black staff will continue to have their knowledge and competence dismissed. If that's acceptable to this board, then we can continue doing what we're doing. If it's not acceptable, then we need to have much harder conversations about transformation rather than just improvement." The board did not, in that meeting or in subsequent meetings, commit to the kind of fundamental transformation Denise had described. But they did authorize additional resources for patient safety initiatives, did approve expanded training programs, did create a board-level committee focused on health equity, with the explicit charge of examining how Presbyterian Memorial's practices contributed to racial disparities in care. It was progress, incremental and insufficient, but real. And it was progress that would not have happened without Denise's willingness to speak up 10 years earlier, when a patient was dying and a physician was wrong, without her refusal to accept institutional punishment quietly, without her persistent advocacy for systemic change, even when that advocacy made her a target. Mrs. Patterson died at age 89, 5 years after Denise saved her life in room 447. She died at home, surrounded by family, having lived those additional years with her daughters and grandchildren, because a hospital janitor had recognized respiratory failure and had refused to be silent when a doctor dismissed her concerns. Denise learned about Mrs. Patterson's death through the hospital grapevine, and she attended the funeral at a small Baptist church in West Charlotte, sitting in the back pew and listening as the pastor and family members spoke about a woman who had lived fully and had loved deeply, and who had understood the value of speaking up and standing firm. Mrs. Patterson's daughter, who had been present during much of her mother's final hospital stay, and who had learned the full story of what happened on September 26th, recognized Denise at the funeral and approached her afterward. "My mother never stopped talking about you. She told everyone that you saved her life, that you fought for her when no one else would. She wanted you to know that those 5 extra years with us were a gift, and that the gift came from you." It was the kind of gratitude that transcended institutional recognition, that mattered more than awards or promotions or salary increases. The knowledge that her actions had given a family additional time with someone they loved, that her refusal to accept dismissal had had consequences that rippled through lives and relationships in ways that could never be fully measured. Denise hugged Mrs. Patterson's daughter and thanked her for sharing those words, and as she drove home from the funeral, she thought about the arc of the past decade, about the ways that one moment of choosing to speak up had cascaded into institutional changes and personal transformations and additional years of life for a woman who might otherwise have died that September night. Jasmine was waiting at the apartment when Denise arrived home, having taken a shift off to be available for her mother after the funeral. They sat together on the couch, not talking much, just being present for each other in the way that family does, when grief or reflection requires companionship more than conversation. "Do you think it was worth it?" Jasmine asked eventually. "Everything you went through, the investigation and the EEOC complaint and the publicity and the years of fighting. Was it worth it for the changes you achieved? Denise considered the question carefully, thinking about the costs and the benefits, the personal sacrifices and the institutional progress, the individual vindication, and the systemic limitations. "I don't know if worth it is the right frame," she said finally. "I made choices based on what seemed necessary at the time. Speaking up when Mrs. Patterson was dying was necessary because letting her die when I could prevent it was unconscionable. Fighting back when the hospital tried to punish me was necessary because accepting that punishment would have reinforced all the dynamics that made my speaking up controversial in the first place. Continuing to push for changes was necessary because individual justice without systemic reform means the same patterns continue. But if you had known at the beginning how hard it would be, how much you would have to sacrifice, would you still have done it? I think so. Because the alternative was being someone who stayed silent when a patient was dying, and I couldn't be that person. Can't be that person. So whatever the costs, they were costs I had to accept in order to be someone I could respect." It was an answer that captured something essential about the ethics of resistance, about the ways that standing up for what was right required accepting consequences that seemed disproportionate to the offense, that institutional change demanded individual sacrifice, that progress was always purchased at great cost by those least able to afford it. Jasmine leaned against her mother's shoulder, and they sat together as the evening light faded, two black women in a nursing profession that often undervalued them, two generations committed to the belief that speaking up mattered even when the cost was high, two people who had learned that justice was never guaranteed, but that silence guaranteed injustice. The story of what happened at Presbyterian Memorial on September 26th, and in the decade that followed, became over time a teaching case used in nursing schools and medical schools and healthcare administration programs across the country. It was used to illustrate the importance of psychological safety in healthcare teams, to demonstrate the consequences of dismissing concerns based on professional hierarchy, to explore the ways that racial bias shaped clinical interactions, and to examine the institutional dynamics that made speaking up risky and staying silent complicit. Denise was occasionally invited to speak at conferences or to participate in panel discussions about patient safety culture and healthcare equity, and she accepted some of these invitations, using them as platforms to tell her story and to push for systemic changes that extended beyond Presbyterian Memorial. She talked about the need for healthcare institutions to value knowledge regardless of credentialing, about the importance of creating reporting mechanisms that protected whistleblowers, about the ways that racial bias created clinical errors that harmed patients and demoralized staff. And she talked about the limits of individual heroism, about the ways that narratives focusing on one person's courage or persistence obscured the structural conditions that made courage and persistence necessary, about the importance of building institutions where speaking up was normal rather than exceptional, where patients received good care regardless of the biases of their providers, where workers were valued for their contributions rather than marginalized based on their position in institutional hierarchies. These lessons, these reflections on institutional culture and individual responsibility and the complex relationship between them, deserve circulation beyond academic conferences and professional development seminars. If you have read this far, if you have engaged with Denise Crawford's story and understood its implications for healthcare and for all institutional settings where hierarchies and biases shape outcomes, consider the value of sharing these insights with others who need to hear them, who work in settings where similar dynamics operate, who face decisions about whether to speak up when they observe harm. The work of creating equitable institutions, of building cultures where all knowledge is valued and all voices are heard, requires many people making difficult choices repeatedly over time. It requires people like Denise, willing to absorb the costs of speaking up. It requires people like Barbara Simmons and Dr. Sarah Chen, willing to support those who speak up, even when doing so creates institutional friction. It requires people like Marcus Webb, willing to provide legal support to those fighting discrimination, and it requires people in leadership positions willing to prioritize justice and equity over institutional convenience and risk management. But most fundamentally, it requires collective recognition that the patterns Denise Crawford experienced are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of systemic problems requiring systemic solutions, that individual victories matter, but are not sufficient, and that the transformation of healthcare and of all institutions requires sustained commitment to identifying and dismantling the hierarchies and biases that create harm. Denise Crawford continues working at Presbyterian Memorial Hospital, continues pushing for changes, continues mentoring younger staff who face the same dynamics she confronted, continues refusing to accept that the way things are is the way things must be. Jasmine Crawford works alongside her mother, applying the lessons she learned both from nursing school and from watching her mother fight institutional injustice, speaking up when she observes patient harm, supporting colleagues who face retaliation for advocacy, contributing to the slow work of cultural transformation. And across Charlotte, across North Carolina, across the United States, healthcare workers at every level of institutional hierarchies face similar moments, similar decisions about whether to speak up or stay silent, whether to challenge authority or accept orders, whether to risk everything for the possibility of creating change or to protect themselves by accommodating the status quo. Some will speak up, some will stay silent. The outcomes will vary based on factors including evidence quality, institutional culture, leadership commitment, legal protections, public pressure, and simple luck. But the accumulated impact of these individual decisions, multiplied across thousands of healthcare facilities and millions of patient interactions, will shape the quality and equity of care in ways that extend far beyond any individual case. That is the real story, the one that exceeds the frame of what happened to Denise Crawford and Mrs. Patterson and Dr. Hendricks on September 26th. The real story is about the infrastructure of justice, about the mechanisms and culture and commitments required to create institutions where competence is valued regardless of credentials, where racial bias does not determine who receives good care and who does not, where speaking up is protected rather than punished, where patients receive the care they need rather than the care that confirms physicians' assumptions. Building that infrastructure requires people willing to speak up as Denise did, willing to fight back when institutions punish them for doing so, willing to persist in pushing for changes even when the changes come slowly and incompletely. It requires people willing to support those who speak up, to create legal and institutional protections, to challenge hierarchies and biases, to prioritize patients over professional ego and equity over institutional convenience. And it requires people willing to pay attention, to bear witness, to share these stories widely enough that the patterns become undeniable and the imperative for change becomes overwhelming. If you have read Denise Crawford's story, if you understand its implications, if you recognize similar dynamics in your own institutional contexts, then you have a responsibility to ensure that this knowledge does not remain private, that these accounts circulate, that the work of transformation continues. The choice Denise faced in room 447 at 2:23 a.m. on that September Thursday, the decision about whether to speak up when a patient was dying and a doctor was wrong, is a choice that people face constantly in healthcare and in every other institutional setting. The consequences of speaking up vary, the consequences of staying silent accumulate, and the difference between institutions that create justice and institutions that perpetuate harm often depends on nothing more complicated than whether enough people, in enough moments, choose to speak rather than to be silent. That is the lesson. That is the call. That is the chronicle that must be shared, must be understood, must be enacted in daily practice by everyone who works in institutions where power is distributed unequally and where silence protects harm. Denise Crawford spoke up. Mrs. Patterson lived 5 additional years. Presbyterian Memorial Hospital implemented changes that improved patient safety and empowered staff. But the work continues, the patterns persist, and the transformation of healthcare remains incomplete. Your role in that transformation, whatever your position in institutional hierarchies, is to decide when silence is complicity and when speaking up is necessary, and then to act accordingly. The rest, the institutional responses and the personal consequences and the social change that may or may not follow, remains always uncertain. But the necessity of trying, of speaking, of refusing to accept injustice quietly, that remains constant.